Hello and welcome to the Paid Media Lab podcast. My name is James. I'm the content lead here at Lunio, and in this episode, I'm speaking with Nick Handley, who is the head of paid media performance at Impression Digital, a specialist performance marketing agency with offices in Manchester, Nottingham, London, and New York. Originally from Yorkshire, Nick has an impressive career record so far, where he started out as a paid media analyst for Halfords and then made the transition from in-house to agency side, where he's worked for the likes of M6 and Rise at 7 here in Manchester, where Nick has gone on to become one of the leading marketing voices in the north of the UK, outside the London bubble. No disrespect to London, it's just always great to see marketers and businesses thriving in the north too. As we get into and mentioned briefly in this conversation, I first came across Nick around 2022 when I watched a Lunio panel webinar where Nick was speaking alongside Rand Fishkin, who is the co-founder of Moz and also now Spark Taro. And in that webinar, I was really impressed with Nick's straight talking, data-driven and pragmatic approach to marketing. And that was one of the main reasons why I made the decision to join the team here at Lunio. So it was great to have the opportunity to sit down with Nick and interview him myself about a really impressive strategy he and his team put together for a very large automotive client based here in the UK. There were a lot of different moving parts to this strategy, and I think there's a lot you can take away and apply to your own campaigns, especially when it comes to product feed management and maximizing the synergy between your paid search campaigns and paid social campaigns, particularly on Meta. So without any further preamble from me, let's get into the conversation. Nick, welcome to the Paid Media Lab. Great to have you on.
Cheers, James. Cheers to be invited as well.
For our main topic of conversation today, Nick, you're going to be talking us through a strategy that you devised for one of your clients in the automotive industry, because there were several interesting aspects to your approach there, which I think listeners might want to consider exploring for themselves. I know obviously if you also work in the automotive industry, this might be especially relevant to you, but even if you don't, I think there's a lot of different aspects to this strategy which would carry across to other businesses. So to kick us off, could you give us a top level overview of what that strategy involved and how you approached it?
Yeah, for sure. I think it'll probably help with a bit of context as well. If anyone's worked in the automotive sector before, especially when you're doing car sales, people know that the amount of products that are there to sell is unfathomably large. It is insanely big. And we actually worked with a relatively big automotive brand that does used car sales. Think of your Auto Trader, but not Auto Trader. I can't give a name, so I'm under NDA for it, sadly. But essentially, they came to us with a bit of a challenge. They wanted to achieve around 20,000 leads from paid media per month, and also to reduce their cost per lead as well, because realistically, they were paying a fair bit per lead, which is not exactly the best thing when you try to sell and get rid of a lot of cars. They also had a huge portfolio. I believe it's actually over, I think it's like 400,000 cars that they always have on site. And with that comes a lot of inventory management, especially from a paid social and paid search point of view. So in terms of what we actually did, the largest bit of the strategy was around actually automating a lot of the feed rules that ran. When we took over, the feed was in a bit of an abysmal state. It didn't have titles, it didn't have your basic hygiene things you'd expect from a feed that powers the back end of things like dynamic ads for paid social, but also things like inventory management for Google Ads as well, which can be really useful when you're working with a lot of products. For us, the main strategy we actually wanted to implement was a personalisation strategy. So instead of it just showing an ad to somebody and be like, oh cool, here's a car. It was, here's a car that you've actually had a relatively big intent with, that you've actually looked at before, or we believe that you're actually going to enjoy. And then from that was sort of like creative personalization as well from a social point of view. And then on a Google side of things, we also think probably one of the bigger ones, which I can jump into a bit more detail. We're, I think, the first agency and the first company within the UK with this brand to use vehicle ads on Google Ads, which essentially is the look of shopping ads, but being able to dynamically show vehicles as well. So it, as you can imagine, performed very well for them.
Yeah, nice. That's definitely something that I want to get into in a little bit, just those kind of vehicle ads. Is there, like, when it comes to, you know, dealing with, if you're in a business where you do have that kind of huge catalog of products, and you do need to kind of maybe make changes to a feed which is not structured as good as it could be, like, where would you start, and what are kind of some of the main challenges around fixing a feed with a huge product catalog?
So I think, first of all, from an agency side, it can be quite difficult to get people to give up feeds or to even work on them, which can be somewhat frustrating. But the biggest one for us is getting somebody internally at a client side to actually understand the importance of it and the importance of how much a feed drives performance around paid media, especially when we know that the front end of paid media is changing and becoming a lot more, dare I say, automated and AI focused, meaning that we have to actually do a lot of work behind the scenes. So the big one for us is getting a feed ready and getting a feed into a place of, like, what would you do to start with? We ideally run it through. We've got internal tools that we run through, but essentially it gives us an understanding of how many titles are missing. Are we slugging with titles? Essentially, are we cutting off titles and it's looking pretty rough when it comes to feeds? Are we actually producing the right product images? Is it things that are resonating with the client, with our customers? And then we essentially pull together a big analysis and give that to our clients, and we said, hey, look, you've got a lot of internal data that needs fixing here. We've got cheating's missing, which is a unique identifier. Granted, you don't need them, but it helps with feed robustness. And you've got a lot of titles that are incorrectly formatted, or there's all these products that are just disapproved because you've not put the correct price in, or there's an issue on site. So that's how we normally always first start, is essentially get our data in order. So when we do generate a feed, it's actually as complete as possible. If we can't do that, we work with clients quite often to use supplemental feeds using third-party tools. So there's a plethora of third-party tools. We actually at the moment use Feedonomics, which is a third-party data feed integrator from things like Shopify, Magento, the rest of them through to things like Google Ads and Meta and even TikTok. But there's plenty out there. You've got Channable as another one that we've used before and we'll probably use again for certain clients. But you can do a lot of rules, and you can create a lot of rules in there to say that if a title doesn't exist, you can pull from a supplemental sheet that may have a joining field that's like a ID or a SKU to then write a correct title if they don't have time internally to write them themselves. So that's generally, I know I've probably gone on a slight tangent there, but that's how we sort of like start optimizing and where we first put our efforts when we look at feeds before we can do all the fun stuff that I know we have done for this client in particular.
Yeah, so kind of really leaning into any tools and technologies that can make that whole process a bit easier, like, definitely makes sense.
Yeah, correct.
So could you, as someone who knows a lot more about them than I do, could you kind of explain what vehicle ads are, how they differ from traditional ads, and if there's anything that's kind of unique about them relative to the standard shopping ads that you would see?
No, I think it's you've covered a lot of it, because I think the biggest one for me is actually having that visualization piece. So before, just for clarity, a lot of, I suppose, especially in the UK, when you came to sell vehicles and do that sort of marketing for the automotive space, it was very much text ad based, or you could do things like display or demand gen. But there wasn't really, that eye-catching piece in the standard SERP page that you see from, shopping ads that e-com retailers get a hell of a lot of, gain out of and a hell of a lot of performance out of. So vehicle ads essentially was the solution for automotive brands to be able to use shopping-esque features. It's quite interesting. It runs through PMax primarily with a vehicle feed. As I mentioned, the vehicle feed is very similar to a shopping feed, and it runs through Merchant Center, so the standard Google side of things. And essentially it allows you to populate some more visually appealing ads and put them in essentially the top of Google pretty much every time that you search for certain cars. It works in the exact same way, in my opinion, as the shopping, shopping ads or anything you see through PMax from a, shopping perspective. So ultimately it allows you to then test different assets and, create high performing ads and use different formats instead of just text ads or some of the more off party SERP ad placements that you do get for Google. So yeah, it's probably the biggest one. So I don't think there's much more I can say than in my opinion, it is just another very clever placement that gives you more space, more share of market, and a bit more of a visually appealing ad type for retailers to be able to show their product to customer.
As you mentioned, as you kind of outlined the strategy, obviously the vehicle ads component of it in Google search was important, but there was a lot more going on outside of Google. So you mentioned Meta, and could you talk us through that process of, creating and utilizing those personalized feeds to put those cars that you think are going to be the right fit for this particular individual, in front of people on Meta?
Yeah, Meta was really interesting. So, as people know, Meta's detection for ads that shouldn't show is probably a bit worse than Google. Google are generally pretty hot at saying you can't show this ad, and it's generally disapproved for things like incorrect images, which I'm going to hone in on this one. Essentially, on Meta, before we even started, the client actually raised a bit of a challenge. But when clients, this company, essentially they're a marketplace for cars, so dealers will upload their images and create their own essentially landing pages and SKUs, and then essentially this client will put them all into the big database, and then that's how it's generated. So it's the marketplace for cars, similar to, as I said, like an auto trader or something like that. Quite often when dealers and dealerships were uploading product information and building out their product SKUs, a lot of them put holding placements for images. So it'd be the name of the dealer and then image coming soon, which funnily enough Meta isn't particularly great at recognizing that that's not a proper image that you should run with. And in this case, the client was like, hey, we've got a lot of these image coming soon placeholders that people are uploading that we can't actually do anything about, and we can't remove them from the feed because there's no rhyme or reason. It's not that there's a systematic way to create a rule like we need to remove these and that's done. So we had to think about it, and probably one of the biggest things that we did, which I absolutely love, and it's probably one of the funnest innovations we've done for feeds, is Google actually recognizes that those feeds are incorrect images, and it flags them within Merchant Center reports. So we used Google's API. We essentially got that into Google Sheets, and we got all of the SKUs, which does it daily, and it pulls out saying, oh, this product, this ID doesn't have a correct image. And then once we've got that from Google and it uploads to the sheet, using our third-party feed integrator, we've got a supplemental feed, which is that sheet that goes into there, and we've got a rule that runs to exclude all those products that don't have image IDs. So we've actually created a massive cost saving and got rid of a lot of waste. I don't know the complete number, but I'm pretty certain it's circa £10,000 a month just from optimizing Meta's feed and getting rid of these products. But that was the biggest first step that we did have, is to how the hell do we, if we're going to do dynamic, I suppose, feed and dynamic product image insertion, how do we get rid of all the bits we didn't want? So that was the first step of how we started that. And then to get to the point that I think you've asked a question on, but I think that's quite an important and salient point in getting there, we optimized the feed and got to the point where we were happy with it. And then we actually used a third party. So we've been using a company called Celtra, and we are looking at developing something like this in-house, but we're just not there yet. But we're essentially using dynamic feed overlays. So if somebody has interacted with our ads before across any of our territories, whether that's, Google, whether that's, Pinterest, whether that's, anything, as long as they've hit the site and we've got, data from the data layer, so essentially customer data that exists, and obviously GDPR compliant with the rest of it. We're then creating these audiences on the back of it through things like Klaviyo and other CRM integrators to then be able to put an audience against an ad, and then be like, okay, we know these people are pocketed into this type of brand, and then we're using internal data to then put the things that they care about on top of that, whether that's price, whether that's condition, whether that's mileage. So each time somebody gets served an ad from them, it'll come up with the things that matter most to them, whether that is things like price, product, or mileage, for example. And that's how we've done a lot of the optimization for Meta. And at the moment, I actually had to write this down because I was like, it was a ridiculous number. At the moment, like the average leads per month is about 30,000 leads per month. So we smashed cashback target. We actually decreased the CPL by 55% versus the 40% that you originally asked for. And a lot of this was done by that data neatness and queuing up the products, but then also this big personalization bit with vehicle ads and also personalized meta placements as well. And I'll pause for breath because I feel that I've got excited about that, and I've just spoken for about 7 minutes on how we've done that. But yeah, that's how it all worked.
Easy to see why you get excited. There's so big numbers in terms of lead volume and some of those metrics improvements there. You mentioned there about, putting price, car condition, mileage, like figuring out what the customer is likely to be most interested in. Sorry, I might have missed it, but could you just clarify, like, how were you finding out that data in relation to this person is likely to be paying attention to mileage? Like, what were you doing to find that out?
So it's done in terms of buckets on site. So we've got a plethora of first-party information, also all stripped down, so there's no personal information that exists in there. But we can create, if people have looked at certain cars or certain brands, there's certain things that people seem to care about a bit more. And we've got that information from seeing where people click and people interact with on site. From that, we've then essentially matched that back within our audience portfolios and being able to say, cool, this sort of person that searches for, let's say, Jaguar, obviously quite topical at the moment. I'm not sure when this is coming out, but they've just changed their logo and it's causing a bit of a stir in the marketing world. But if people are searching for Jaguar, you find that price is probably the thing they care about the most. Therefore, we dynamically insert the price of the car that they've seen or the price of, a Jag that is quite high selling into the feed and into the ad that they see. And that's how we sort of built that link between what the person sees versus what we believe should be delivered to them.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. And you can see, like, that is, if you can get that right, it's bound to have a big impact on performance. And obviously it has done, reflected in the numbers that you just listed there. There's a lot of moving parts going on here, a lot of different channels working together to kind of drive results. And I know measuring marketing performance is something that you've spoken on a lot at events. Obviously, it has become much harder than it was a decade ago, especially, when you do have more moving parts to a strategy like this. So first of all, could you just kind of explain why measuring the overall and holistic impact of marketing is so challenging today in 2024 and as we move into 2025?
Yeah, it's probably one of my favorite topics to speak on. I'm actually, funnily enough, speaking on the topic tonight at another event. But one of the big ones for me is, like, obviously we've got, like, we can all shout about cookies dying and being deprecated, which it's been said for the past 2-3 years. But if we look at where people want to put budgets now, everyone wants to have one source of truth, right? And we know that platforms fight against each other. We know that GA, as in Google Analytics, it does underweight certain channels, it favors others, and you're going to find that through pretty much everything. So if we can remove the noise and move away from attribution to contribution through things like MMN or econometrics, whatever you want to call it, it allows us to have a bit of an understanding of where better to put our budgets. It feels almost a bit old school with new ways of working, is how I generally look upon it, where we're able to actually say, run a test and understand, like, what is actually contributing towards our sales, and for all that, you don't take any platform data barring spend, and then internal sales data to be able to get to that and run these bigger models. So I think it's really important for marketers to be able to actually understand where they should put budget. And especially, it's more important to me now is that we know brand and performance, like, everyone used to fight about, it's brand versus performance. Like, let's be honest, everything's moving very close together with the rise of like content creators, the rise of authenticity from brands, but then having to sort of like hammer that through performance channels as well, and having that wider piece of saying this actually contributed X amount of sales or revenue, and we should be actually focusing more on that next year, give rise to these platforms that weren't necessarily seen as big drivers in the first place. Like, look at TikTok, look at social. I know that socials, I think, has or will be overtaking like SERP spend from an ads perspective, either in end of 2024-25. So I think that's probably the main reasons why I think it's really important for us to have, I suppose, measurement at the forefront, and why it's important now, but probably always has been, but it's been talked about a bit more.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, like, as you mentioned, social spend ramping up, and then I think particularly interesting development on the TikTok side, their introduction of keyword targeting in their ads like that, I feel like is definitely going to take a little bit of a dent out of Google's ad revenue if people find that, especially on the e-commerce side, TikTok keywords ad targeting could be very profitable there. In terms of this particular strategy that you implemented for this client, I know you use both incrementality tests and uplift tests as well to kind of measure the impact of the changes that you were making. So could you just kind of talk us through those incrementality tests and uplift tests and what some of the key results were that you found from those?
Yeah, I think incrementality is always a fun one to talk about. For anyone that hasn't really, done much in terms of incrementality, you can do it in multiple different ways. You've also got, in-platform incrementality tests. You can run your own, which we generally do geo holdouts, and just so people are aware, geo holdouts essentially take one part of, your territory you're advertising, in this case the UK, and then you create artificial control, so you don't have to actually, base it against all other territories. It's just the one that you're actually changing things in. So when we look at it, it's not saying, like the test is versus the rest of the UK, because it doesn't necessarily receive indicative results, but we create an artificial control that then allows us to understand whether it would have outperformed without having to change any other variables as well. And in this case, we ran that for Meta. So we actually increased our spend on Meta, which you could probably tell the reasons why, and because it performed really well. But just because it performed well, we saw an increase, we wanted to prove it. So in this case, we ran incrementality tests across Meta and did it in holdout areas, sort of testing areas, to understand whether it was having the desired impact that we did want. And as you can see from the results, it massively did. So we continued running with it, and it was a small one. The idea is this client, we are probably going to be running some more like MMM-based studies and some more incrementality tests as we go through. But this was probably the first step in the water and allowed us to, not just educate the clients. Clients incredibly in tune with like what we do and, how marketing works, but equips us and them to be able to prove that to other stakeholders internally as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, as you said, like going to those key stakeholders with that data in hand is crucial when you're working on these kinds of projects. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of close things out with a final question. So there's a lot we've covered there. I think there's a lot of useful information, particularly with regard to feed management, but also personalization and what people can do to put the right products in front of people at the right time. But for anyone that is interested in maybe trying a somewhat similar approach, are there any key pieces of advice that you would leave marketers with if they were looking to implement something similar?
Yeah, I think probably the big one is, I think it's going to have to be optimize your feed so you're ready to do this sort of test and to run this sort of strategy. Personalization can't exist without a very strong base feed or very strong base data points. So work with your clients, or if you are in-house, have a look at like what's missing. Is there, content that needs to be generated? Is there, titles that need to be changed? Is there data that needs to be backfilled because you've just not done it and got around to doing it? And I know that it can be a massive pain to be able to backfill information, but trust me, it will help and it will work wonders. And not just from doing this, but just from having a well-optimized feed for things like Google and Meta, you index better with actual searches. And it also does help on the other side of things, on the organic side, having a merchant center feed that you can use for, organic listings as well within shopping. So yeah, that'd be my biggest takeaway, is optimize your feeds before you even think of doing any personalization. And then secondly, just make sure that you're actually running tests. Hypothesize, like, what do you want to test and why do you want to do it? What do you think will work and what won't? And then start small. People are quite resilient to change if you do it in small increments. So think of a test that would actually be quite fun to test and do a holdout, or change it through using a third-party feed. Or if you're using Google, change it using essentially a supplemental feed if you really want to. And then from there, just repeat and rinse your results until you get something that actually works. And those are I suppose, top level points, I'd say. And also, feel free to reach out if you do need a hand of any of this. Like, I love talking foods.
Yeah. Some of the getting that groundwork right. It's not the sexiest work in the world, but it's the essential stuff that if you're interested in doing this, you can't kind of leapfrog over that and get to the more advanced, tricky stuff. You need to start with the basics. Solid advice there, Nick, and thank you so much for joining us today. Really interesting to hear kind of you talk through the tactics that you use to deliver those seriously impressive results for that particular client. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to mention or let people know about?
No, I don't think. I'm not going to shill my agency, but if anyone does want to look for an agency, Impression, we're a full channel media agency, backed obviously by measurement and backed by creativity. We've just recently launched a creative service in the past year. So if you do want to get in touch, please do. And now I've got the agency stuff out of the way. Just thanks, James, for having me on again. Appreciate all the questions and appreciate us having a chat.
No, it was great. And hopefully we'll be able to connect in person in Manchester soon again at some point. And I must get myself to more meetups and events because I know there is a lot more starting to happen in Manchester and up north, which is great to see. But yeah, thanks again, Nick. It was a pleasure.
Cheers, James.
That's it for this episode of the Paid Media Lab. Thank you for tuning in. If you found it helpful, hit the subscribe button to get the next episode as soon as it's released. Subscribing costs nothing. It only takes a few seconds to do, but it makes a huge difference to us because it enables us to continue booking the best possible guests and delivering you great content. In the meantime, if you're looking for more free guides, tips, and tools, head to lunio.ai and click on the resources tab in the nav bar. And lastly, if you know any other marketers who'd find these strategies helpful, please do tell them about the show, and I'll see you in the next episode.